All right, before we get finished or started, excuse me, on Into the Wild, I want to encourage you guys to keep paying attention to emails sent out from school about locker cleanouts. They have some strict rules about how that's going to happen. That'll all be forthcoming. I'll try to pass that along to you um, in try to pass that along to you as it comes available to me. Also, want to encourage you taking the exam next week. Make sure you attack that rhetorical analysis that I posted on the COVID page, and there's about a 12-minute video that breaks it down. So take a look at that. I'll do one more next Monday, which is the day before, but it'll all be there for you. All right. Yes, that is correct, Jacob. Got to have a mask, gloves, and your temperature will be taken. So it won't be a time for joyous reunion. It'll be get in there, get your stuff, and get out. It'll be kind of pretty sanitary, not very fun. So, but it is. We got to do what we got to do. So I hope everybody's finished with their summer reading. You're welcome. There's none, as we know. But let's get started on it. And I know there are students that are taking the AP exam today, and I know there are plenty of students who'll be watching this later, so I don't want to delay too much, and I just want to get right after it. So we will start on chapter 7, and I'll walk you through this book. The key to this book is, besides the fact that as students we are relating to this kid because he may have some exhibit some qualities that we empathize with. There's also the fact that he ties into all the transcendentalist that we have learned about, and that philosophy that goes with that. And then also, besides that, is the the thing that we didn't get to talk too much about. It's actually the structure of the book rhetorically is masterful because the idea is Krakauer is trying to set you up to have some sympathy for this kid and trying to get you to empathize with him. And so there's a lot done here with ethos. And in these section of chapters, there is some time spent on that. If you look at page 61, where we shall begin, there's a quote about, at the very beginning, these quotes are very vital in understanding the book. It says, it is true that many creative people fail to make mature personal relationships, and some are extremely isolated. It is also true that in some instances, trauma in the shape of early separation or bereavement has steered the potentially creative person toward developing aspects of his personality which can find fulfillment in comparative isolation. So when we're talking about people who go off into the woods by themselves, Thoreau was one, Jon Muir was one, and we have this comment from Arthur Storr, a person I'm not particularly familiar with. Also, if you paid attention to the name of the man we read for the rhetorical analysis, it was Edward Abbey, who is mentioned in these chapters. I'll point that out to you. Again, another guy who lived out by himself in the wild. Okay, so this idea that stuff that happens to us when we're younger reminds me of the line from Gladiator: "What we do in life echoes in eternity." It's better when Russell Crowe says it, of course, in Roman attire. And we could kind of change that for our own selves of our experiences as a child echo in adulthood. And what happens to Chris McCandless as a young kid with his parents is what sort of triggers all of this, and that is forthcoming. But right now, Krakauer is trying to get you to understand what the kid is doing and that he is not a lunatic. And I say kid, I shouldn't say that, young adult. He is a 22-year-old college grad. So as you get older, they become kids. You'll see on as you get through into 64, there's a lot of talk about how Chris McCandless did not have a good relationship with his father. And that parental relationship was problematic. and that is the root of his basically fleeing and running. Okay, and I'll let that play out. I'll let Krakauer play that, put that out. But in there's an interesting passage about celibacy in here, and I do want to talk about that for a minute, because Thoreau was celibate. He was a lifelong virgin, and there was talk about Tolstoy leaving it all, in I think it's later in the book, leaving it all and becoming celibate and living destitute. I'm sure everyone's well aware in Catholicism, priests are to take a vow of celibacy, and primary their focus should be on things of the spirit and the mind and not of the flesh. There are other religious monks and such that take vows of celibacy. So this is something that's been around for human existence for a long time, because it is, I should say, it's not our natural inclination. And on 66, they quote, and in the chapter Higher Laws by Henry David Thoreau out of Walden, in a copy that McCandless had highlighted, and we already talked about the importance of highlighting. Chastity, this is Thoreau, chastity is the flowering of man, and what are called genius, heroism, holiness, and the like are but various fruits which succeed it. Okay, so you need the first for the others to come to being. And again, there is quite a few famous people that were like that. I can think of some of my own people that I've studied. For instance, Lawrence of Arabia was that way, and nothing to do with transcendentalism, but did run away from civilization. Seems to be a commonality there. But a little further down on 66, it says, McCandless's apparent sexual innocence, however, is a corollary of a personality type that our culture purports to admire, at least in the case of the more famous adherents. His ambivalence towards sex echoes that of a celebrated others who embraced wilderness with single-minded passion. Thoreau, who was a lifelong virgin, and the naturalist Jon Muir, most prominently, to say nothing of countless lesser-known pilgrims, that of Jon Muir, that we don't get to spend too much time with Jon Muir. Jon Muir was the Henry David Thoreau of the 20th century. He lived most of his life out west and in California. The Jon Muir Trail is in California. There's all kinds of things named after him out there. He is the founder of the Sierra Club, which is a pro-environmentalist, pro-nature kind of group. Anything to do with the wilderness and the wild, it is Jon Muir. And then he also has written books about being outside and his dedication to nature. And I think probably one of his most telling and lasting legacies is the fact that he took President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, out into the wild, out to the redwood forest, took him out camping in the redwoods, and gave Roosevelt a sort of spiritual and naturalistic awakening. And when Teddy Roosevelt comes back from this experience, it's not long after that the national parks began to pop up, and that whole process that Teddy Roosevelt started. And it has much to do with Jon Muir and his influence. Jon Muir directly has a hand in our national parks, and it all started in the redwood forest. So something that more people we probably should do a better job reading about. On the last part of chapter 7, and I saw this in some comments, wondering if he actually wanted to die, thought he was going to die, hoped to die, all those things. Because he says, if this adventure proves fatal and you don't hear from me again, I now walk into the wild. There could be a little bit of hubris here, a little bit of bravado, a bit of hyperbole. I can tell you, I've gone on some adventures myself to Knife's Edge and Wetterhorn, two mountains, and Colorado. And those were messages I left because I was doing something I thought that was pretty daring. And in most respects, they were daring to most people, but compared to other adventurers, they really weren't. But I said things like that, So I don't. There's a little bit of connection between obviously me, Thoreau, McCandless, Muir, and those guys. And so I've uttered those types of words. And one reason I haven't been back to something like Knife's Edge is I found that falling 2, 3, 4,000 feet to my death was not really something I was interested in, or even attempting it again. So I get a little bit of that. So I don't think he was suicidal. I think he just wanted to let the world know that, I'm going to do what you're not doing. That's more personal reflection than maybe fact. Moving on to chapter 8, page 70. We have in America the big two-hearted river tradition, taking your wounds to the wilderness for a cure, a conversion, a rest, or whatever. And as in the Hemingway story, if your wounds aren't too bad, it works. But this isn't Michigan or Faulkner's big woods in Mississippi, for that matter. This is Alaska. And this piece from Edward Hoagland, who I have heard of and read of him in magazines dealing with outdoors, adventure, and such. This is a common theme in America of going to the wilderness to find yourself. It's in countless movies, countless things that we read, and so it's not abnormal. But this whole chapter, all of chapter 8, is an establishment of credibility, of ethos. And Krakauer very carefully presents us with a very fascinating list of people who also did what Chris McCandless did and also ended up dead. And some of them were lunatics. There's a lot of Thoreau kind of attitude here with some of these guys and Chris McCandless. And they ultimately all end up dead because of generally their own folly or their own maybe lack of stability and mindset. And probably the worst one was the guy who had a great infill on how to infiltrate where he was going, but no exfil. And when the plane went by, he gave the wrong sign. He gave the wrong sign of everything's fine, and they let him go. And he ended up committing suicide. All the little pieces in there are fascinating because he's not the only one to do it. And I think that is what Krakauer is trying to tell you. Chris McCandless is not alone. He's not just some dunce, okay? This is a normal human quality. And we saw it in Tom Wingfield, if you remember. Tom Wingfield said, I am tired of the movies and I am about to move. And so with Krakauer, and he's trying to establish Chris's credibility and, of course, his own credibility, because Krakauer is going to tell us later on the time that he did this. Both of these guys are not alone. Many, many people have done this. It's who knows? It could be biological. That's a conversation for another time. I have seen and read. This seems to be a commonality amongst men. You don't see there weren't any women examples given, and I don't. That's for biological scientists. But remember, Tom says to his mother, Tom Wingfield, man is by instinct a lover, a hunter, and a fighter, and none of those instincts get much play at a warehouse. And Tom Wingfield wants to get out there, and we've seen that in other people. Man in general, man, not women, man in this have sometimes this disproportionate amount of drive for accomplishments filled with glory or hubris or honors, and then ultimately sometimes horrors. Yes, it is men who think that it's a good idea to walk to the top of Mount Everest without oxygen. It's men who think it's a good idea to walk to the bottom of Antarctica. Women have done it since then, but some of the zaniest experiments by mankind have been first attempted by men. Many of their bodies are still there where they tried to do it. And then ultimately, on the flip side, megalomania and things like tyranny, often also perpetrated by men. But So that gives us a George Mallory who goes to Everest, but also gives us an Adolf Hitler who wants to conquer the world. And again, I don't know what the biological aspect of that is, but history shows us that this is typically something that men have find themselves in doing. And I've taught this book enough that a lot of female students they cannot relate to the fact that, one, he would run away from his parents and not let them know what was going on, or two, do something so daringly absurd that it did get him killed. And that's what Krakauer's doing in chapter 8. He's showing you that this is a regular occurrence. So, and then finally, moving on to chapter 9. And this last part of 8, about the credibility. Bottom 84, top 85. He says, there are similarities among Rossellini, Waterman, McCune, and McCandless. Like Rossellini and Waterman, McCandless was a seeker and had an impractical fascination with the harsh side of nature. Like Waterman and McCune, he displayed a staggering paucity of common sense. Paucity, great word for just a very little amount, opposite of plethora. Particularly well to the bush casualty stereotype. Although he was rash and untutored in the ways of the backcountry and incautious to the point of foolhardiness, he wasn't incompetent, and he wouldn't have lasted 113 days if he were. He wasn't a nutcase. He wasn't a sociopath. He wasn't an outcast. McCandless was something else, although precisely what it is hard to say. A pilgrim, perhaps. And this leads him into this idea of pilgrim, because that's going to take us into chapter 9 and the guy by the name of Everett Roos. I've known Everett Roos for a decade because I've been reading Backpacker, National Geographic Adventure, and all these things. And Everett Roos is the John the Baptist of hikers and adventure seekers. This is a kid who at 20 said the heck with the world and went out west when there was nothing out there. There's not a lot out there now, but there's nothing then. And found apparently his happiness, but also disappeared and was never seen from again. All kinds of stories about whether he disappeared, committed suicide, met some tragic fall, or was murdered. I've heard and read about a bunch of them. But in the very beginning of chapter 9, that bottom first quote from Everett Roos, a letter that he wrote, he said, "Even from your scant description, I know that I could not bear the routine and humdrum of the life that you are forced to lead. I don't think I could ever settle down. I have known too much the depths of life already, and I would prefer anything to an anticlimax." This is, remember what Tom Wingfield said, I'm tired of the movies and I am about to move. Or what he tells his mother, I'd rather someone pick up a crowbar and batter out my brains than go back in mornings. Or that I'm boiling inside, and I know that life is not to pick up a shoe and put it in a box. Tom Wingfield is the embodiment in literature, what many of these people have been in life. And if you look at early American history, right, when America was getting too crowded, back when America was a population of 3 million, not 330 million, right? America was too crowded east of the Appalachian Mountains. Some of the great crazy pioneers came out to this crazy area of Kentucky and the Northwest Territory of Ohio and Tennessee and so on, right? And these pioneers, right, were there, and then Mississippi became that line, and then of course we have the Louisiana Purchase, and you got guys like Lewis and Clark walking to California and back. There's been no shortage of Americans seeking to go out into the wilderness, and probably has a lot to do genetically with the nuts who left Europe to come here. Okay, we like to paint them up as, freedom seekers and religious freedom seekers, but most of the religious freedom seekers were zealots, and they were, and most of the people that came here were outcasts, and so this seems to be a pattern. Okay, but just remember Tom Wingfield in this part. But like I said, Everett Roos is kind of like the John the Baptist. If you don't know John the Baptist from the Bible, he lived out in the wilderness eating honey and locusts until Jesus showed up and said, "Baptize me." and then Jesus was baptized, goes about his ministry. John the Baptist is captured and beheaded. And there's not a lot about John the Baptist in the Bible, but there's a lot of speculation about his followers, right? Everett Roost has that sort of mythical following, though he never was too much into the writing. His letters are really what we have. But this is what Everett Roost was after was beauty. And he conceived beauty in pretty romantic terms. We might be inclined to laugh at the extravagance of his beauty worship if there were not something almost magnificent in his single-minded dedication to it. Aesthetics, as a parlor affectation, is ludicrous and sometimes a little obscene. As a way of life, it sometimes attains dignity. If we laugh at Everett Roost, we shall have to laugh at Jon Muir, okay? Because there was little difference between them except age. Yeah, Jon Muir lived a long life and had many accomplishments. Everett Roost disappeared. And from everything I read, the likelihood is that he was murdered by bandits. So there's a whole bunch in here about Everett Roost and who he was and what he did. And we don't need to go into all of that. But if you look on 90, the very bottom of 90, this is another writing of Everett Roost, but it says towards the bottom, from his camps by the water pockets or the canyons or high on the timber ridges of the Navajo Mountain, he wrote long, lush, enthusiastic letters to his family and friends, damning the stereotypes of civilization, Thoreau, Emerson, Tom Wingfield, right? Chanting his barbaric adolescent yelp into the teeth of the world. Well, if you remember, and you may not, Walt Whitman said, "I want to sound my barbaric yelp over the rooftops of the world." Whitman, another transcendentalist. Down a little further, again, in the lettering, Everett Roost's correspondence reveals uncanny parallels between Roost and McCandless, right? Some other letters that he wrote. But he says, "I have always been unsatisfied with life, and most people live it. Always I want to live more intensely and more richly." Remember what Thoreau said. I wanted to live deep and suck out the marrow of life. I wanted to front life, put it into a corner, and see what it had to teach, so that when I came to die, I did not learn that I had not yet lived. Okay? Again, another sort of normality here in this type of adventures, right? So, finishing up, because we've talked about Jon Muir, I'd like you to Slight believes that if Roost had made it across the river alive and reached the reservation, it would have been impossible for him to conceal his presence, even if he was still playing his Nemo game. Remember, Nemo means no one. Everett was a loner, but he liked people too damn much to stay down there and live in a secret for the rest of his life. A lot of us are like that. I am like that. This is the writer Slight. Ed Abbey was like, but we can't stand to be around people for too long. So we have to get lost ourselves, come back for a while, and then get the hell out again, right? And that's what Everett was doing. We talk about, mentions Ed Abbey. That's Edward Abbey. And that was the piece of the rhetorical analysis that was given to you on Monday, okay? He was living in Arches National Park and writing about its need to balance that with water. So again, so much of this is in our history. And finally, the last thing that Krakauer is trying to do, he's trying to tell you that McCandless is not a quack. He talks about how the Irish monks got in, I think they were called curricles. These were boats that you and I would not get on the Little Miami River in and start paddling away across the sea. And that's how they got to Ireland. They were in Ireland, and then in 30. These guys, okay, were going out ill-equipped to places that killed them all, okay? And so we need to kind of remember that, embrace that as part of the human experience. All right. Well, with that, we will say, reach out to me if you have any questions at all. Be good.